We're going to begin today's build by taking a look at the symbol mapping on the formers. Our overall game plan for putting together today's aircraft is we're going to start by taking the individual pieces and creating components. We're going to then combine components into assemblies. Once the assemblies are complete, they're going to be combined with other assemblies, and we're going to continue this process until the aircraft is completed. Let's take a look at our formers. Let's begin by taking a look at our F2 former. If you look over here on the right-hand side, you're going to notice a symbol. This symbol is our stack symbol. Anytime you see that symbol, we're going to be stacking parts on top of one another. Now, it's very important that the parts go in the correct order. So if you look here, we've got F2 and F2. That tells us that this stack will consist of two parts. We see the first F2 is underlined on this part, and the second F2 is underlined on that part. The parts are going to go together like this. Anytime you see the underline under the first set of markings, that means it goes on top. So let's go ahead and glue the two parts together. Right, once that's done, let's grab these two formers. Now you'll notice that I've got an F5 and an F6. They're labeled differently because they're different shapes, but the symbol mapping tells us that these two parts will go together. The F5, which is in the first position, is underlined, so that is the one that'll be on top. So the two parts are going to go together just like this. If you notice right here, we've got a symbol that tells us not to apply glue right down the center. There's also a little razor blade symbol. We'll get to that a little later. Whenever I glue parts together, I always add glue to the smaller of the two parts. I'm going to run a bead of glue in these two areas. Notice that I'm not putting glue between the dotted lines. I'm also keeping the glue away from the little circle cutouts. Make sure everything lines up well, and we'll set it off to the side to cool down. You can see on the F3 and F4 formers, it's just like the previous one. We've got two different shapes. We want to make sure they're in the correct order. F3 goes on top of F4 like that. I'm going to apply glue to the smaller part. I'm going to check alignment. We'll set this off to the side while it cools down. You'll notice here we've got two different materials. That's okay. Taking a look at our foam part, we see that the XM, which is going to be a wooden mount, is going to be attaching to the F1 former. So our parts will go together just like this. Sometimes when you've got a wooden component, the outer diameter will be slightly smaller than the foam itself. Anytime you run into that, go ahead and just center the wooden part on the foam piece. This one's a 1-to-1 fit, so we don't have to worry about that. I'm going to apply a bead of glue to the foam, and then we'll attach the wood. We'll let that cool down, and we'll begin working on the tail section. Now that we've got the formers done, we're going to turn our attention to the tail section. Before we get started on the tail section, there's something I want to point out. I've got all the pieces laid out to create the fuselage. You'll notice I've got C5, C4, C3, C2, and C1. Notice that they're all down the same side. As you begin assembling, you'll want to make sure that all of the markings are running down the same side. It's very easy to take a piece like this and turn it around. While it may physically go together, the shape of the fuselage will not be correct. So it's important that you always pay attention that the markings stay on one side of the glue seam. We're going to begin with the skin labeled C5. Let's first take a look at the markings. You'll notice this symbol right here. This is our remove foam symbol. Anytime you see this symbol, you're going to remove foam from the area indicated. This arrow is pointing at a channel running from one end to the other. To remove the foam, I'm going to take the back side of my razor blade, I'm going to run it down each of the scores. I'm going to crack it open, and we're going to remove the foam. Now I'll do the same on the other side. The next symbol we're going to be taking a look at is our peel paper symbol. Anytime you see this symbol, you're simply going to peel the paper away from the area where indicated. The paper down the middle doesn't matter one way or the other. Since it started to peel off, I'm going to go ahead and peel the rest of it away. Once that's done, let's talk about adding shape. In order to get the shape we want, what we need to do is we need to crush the underside of the foam. By crushing the underside of the foam, that gives us a nice, smooth, gentle curve. But it's important that we add shape in the correct place. I'm going to take a Sharpie, and right here where I've got this stair step, I'm going to draw a shape that goes towards the back of the aircraft, and I'm going to loop it back to about here. I'm going to mirror that on the other side. This isn't really critical, but it's helpful whenever we go to add shape that the shape is being added to the correct areas. Now that we've got our foam marked, let's go ahead and add some shape. In order to do that, I'm going to line up this bottom line with the edge of the table, and I'm going to lay my hand flat on top of the paper. Next, I'm going to draw the part over the edge of the table with my left hand while applying pressure with my right hand. I'm going to go back and do that a couple times. Each time, I'm going to apply a little bit more pressure. You can see that I'm starting to work my hand backwards. If we look at our part, you can see that we've got a nice, smooth, gentle curve. I'm going to add a little bit more shape up here. And once I've done that, I'm going to flip it around. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Once I've added my shape, I'm going to gently fold the entire skin over on itself. It's very important on this step that you have a very light touch. You don't want to press down at any particular point. You want to keep your hands very flat so you don't end up crinkling the foam. Once you get this folded all the way over on itself, leave it for a good 3 or 4 minutes in this position. This will help the foam break down. It'll make the gluing process much easier. On this next step, we're going to be doing a B-fold. A B-fold is where the side plate is beside the bottom plate. Now normally on a B-fold, we're going to fold it up to a 90-degree angle. Instead of it being a perfect 90 degrees, I'm only going to fold it to about 80 degrees, just like that. I'm going to run a bead of glue about 5 inches long. I'm not going to run glue all the way to the end. I'm going to hold that at about 80 degrees. I'm going to give this a full 2.5 minutes to cool down. Then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Next, we need to bring our two edges together. If we try to bring our edges together right now, there's going to be a little bit of a gap from about here all the way back. I'm going to add just a small bevel about 6 inches in length. You can see I'm not taking off very much material at all. It doesn't take much. Once I've created my bevel, I want to bring my two edges together. I want to make sure my seam looks good. When gluing the two edges together, it's very important that up here at the front that the two corners are even with one another. You want to make sure that you don't have a stair step like that. Once our test fit looks good, let's go ahead and tear off 3 pieces of tape, then we're going to add some glue. I'm going to add a bead of glue all the way from one end to the other. When gluing edges together, the side that does not have glue will shingle over the side that does have glue. This forces all the excess glue to the inside where it'll be hidden. I want to start up here at the front. I want to make sure that my edges are even with one another, and I'm going to run a piece of tape across the seam. Put one here at the back, and I'm going to put one here in the middle. We'll let that cool down for a minute, then we're going to test fit our first former. Now that that's had a chance to cool, let's take a look at our F5, F6 former. We're going to drop it in place. When installing the former, you're only going to be putting it into a depth of one layer. You'll notice that one layer of foam is still sticking out. Our test fit looks good. You'll notice that it looks a little bit loose. I would always rather have a former loose than tight. I'm going to run a bead of glue right along the bottom, and I'm going to reinstall the former. And I'm going to hold it in place while the glue cools. Again, make sure that you have one layer of foam sticking out evenly all the way around. Now that that's had a chance to cool down, I'm going to gently squeeze top and bottom with my finger and thumb and apply a bead of glue between the former and the skin. Do the same on the other side. I'm gently going to squeeze here and here, and any excess glue that we have, I'm going to wipe away using a piece of scrap. I'm going to hold this in place for a full 2.5 minutes. I want to make sure that the skin doesn't break loose from the former. Once that's had a chance to cool down, we're going to install our first pushrod housing. The pushrod housing that we're going to be installing is the one right under the F5, F6 markings. To install the pushrod housing, I'm simply going to push it through, and I'm going to look for it to come out here at the back. I need it to feed through the pill-shaped slot, so using a push rod, I'm going to catch the housing and I'm going to feed it through. And I'm going to push the push rod housing through until I've got about 1.5 inches sticking out here at the front. I'm going to apply a bead of glue in the cavity formed between the skin and the push rod housing. I want to make sure that cools all the way down before I pick up my part, otherwise you're going to have a heavy bead of glue trying to make a run for it. Now that we've got our first pushrod housing installed, let's go ahead and make a cut here in the former. Before we make the cut in the former, I want to talk about this symbol right here. I had referenced it earlier. Anytime you see this razor blade symbol, the cut will be made after the assembly is glued together. Let's go ahead and cut these two lines using a razor blade. Once we make our cut, go ahead and tear the channel away and let's test fit our spline. To test fit the spline, make sure that it's oriented correctly, and we're going to push it straight in. And we're going to keep pushing until this is flush with the former. Once our test fit is done, remove your spline, and we're going to apply a heavy bead of glue here and a heavy bead of glue all the way down the bottom. Once we've added glue, go ahead and reinsert your spline. You can also run a bead of glue where the spline meets a former. Do that on both sides. And I always put a little glue here at the top as well. I do want to ensure that I wipe away the excess glue right on top of the F5 former. We're going to be wrapping the skin, and it's important not to have a big blob of glue there. Now that the spline's been installed, let's go ahead and install our second pushrod housing. Just like before, I'm going to push it through the formers and run it to the back of the plane. Using a push rod, I'm going to hook the pushrod housing and feed it through. I'm going to push it through the former to where I've got about a little over an inch sticking out. And just like before, I'm going to add a bead of glue in the cavity formed between the pushrod housing and the skin. We'll let that cool down and you can cut it off just like you did on the other side. Now that we've got our pushrod housing cut off, let's make a cut for the horizontal stabilizer. In order to make our cut, I'm simply going to hold my razor blade flat and I'm going to play connect the dots. Once we've removed the material from either side, if there's any material sticking up in the middle, use a razor blade and trim it to where it's the same height as the two side pieces. Once our slot's been cut, we can go ahead and begin working on our vertical and horizontal stabilizer. Using the back side of our razor blade, I'm going to run down the score here on the horizontal stabilizer. Once I go down the score, I'm going to break it open. Now that we've folded back our elevator, you'll notice that we've got two symbols, one here and one here on the other end. This is a bevel start and the other is a bevel stop. Anytime you see these symbols, you're going to be adding a bevel. Let's go ahead and do that now. I'm holding my razor blade at a 45-degree angle and it's swept forward at about a 45-degree angle. This gives me a nice clean cut. Once I've added my bevel, I'm going to add a bead of glue right down the hinge. Before the glue cools down, using a piece of scrap, I'm going to wipe away all the excess. It's very important that you get all of the excess glue. If you don't, you might run into control issues once you get your plane in the air. Now we're going to do the same thing on the vertical stabilizer. First thing we're going to do is run the back side of a razor blade down the score. We're going to fold it back on itself. And we're going to add a bevel between the two bevel symbols. Once the glue's had a chance to cool down, let's do our first test fit. When test fitting our horizontal stabilizer, it's really important that here at the top, this is pinched together fairly tightly. I'm being careful not to crinkle the foam, but I want to give it a little bit of attention. I want to try and break the foam down right along the top. I want it to hold its shape whenever we install the horizontal stabilizer. You'll notice on our horizontal stabilizer that we've got some reference marks. Whenever you do your installation, watch for those reference marks so you don't accidentally twist your horizontal stabilizer one way or the other. All right, you can see how I'm pinching the top of the tail section, and that'll allow this to stand up just a little bit taller. We want to make sure that it isn't flattened out and really wide. Okay, our test fit looks good. Now I'm going to add a bead of glue inside of the reference marks on both sides. I'm also going to add a small amount of glue to that center spline. It's a little tricky to apply the glue here. I'm going to turn it vertical and just drip a little bit of glue down. It doesn't take a whole lot to keep it in place. Next, I'm going to slide my horizontal stabilizer in place. Make sure it's centered and squared. And then I'm going to take and pinch here along the top. I'm going to hold this in place for a full 2.5 minutes. Once our horizontal assembly is glued in place, we're going to install the vertical stabilizer. The little tab goes right in the back. It'll push all the way up against the spline, and then the vertical stabilizer will go right along the top. There are a couple reference marks, one here and one here at the back. We're simply going to center it and glue everything in place. Once we've done our test fit, I'm going to put glue right along the back of the spline. Just like we did a minute ago, I'm going to simply drop it down. And we're going to push that tongue all the way in until it makes contact with the spline. Once that's done, I'm going to run a light bead of glue between these two reference marks. And I'm going to hold this in place for a full 2.5 minutes while the glue cools. We might have to make a small adjustment once the main wing is in place. Once our tail has been glued in place, let's take a look at our C4 skin. The only symbol we have on here is the peel paper. Let's go ahead and do that now. Once we've got all the paper removed, I'm going to mark my zones. We're going to be adding shape from the middle here down to about here. Do that on both sides. We're also going to add a little bit of shape right here. Right here in this area, we're leaving it fairly flat. There's not a lot of shape, so we're going to spend most of our time down the middle and on either edge. I'm going to add just a little bit of shape, but I'm only applying a very small amount of pressure. All right, once I've got my shape added, I'm going to take a look at my F5 and F6 former. You'll notice that it's going to get pinched right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a cut, and I'm going to parallel the edge of the F5 former, so that when that skin drops in place, it won't be bound up. Once I've got that removed, I'm going to locate the reference mark here at the back of the C4 skin, and I'm going to push it all the way up against that F5 former. All right, and I want to push it in fairly hard, and when the sides fold down, I want to make sure that I don't have a gap. And you can see I've got a pretty good gap. So I've got some interference here. Evidently, this F6 former is sticking out a little bit too much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to extend this center mark. And all this will be hidden by the canopy, so you don't have to worry about it showing. I'm going to cut away a little bit wider of a piece of foam than the gap that we saw a couple moments ago. All right, let's reinstall. Now when we drop the sides down, that gap is closed. When I bring my two skins together, the C4 skin will slightly overlap the C5 skin. That looks really good. So once I'm happy with the fit, I'm going to run a bead of glue about 1 inch wide across the top of this former. One thing I'm really watching for, I want to make sure that that reference mark on top is right in the center of the spline that pokes through the F6 former. I'm going to hold this in place for a full 2.5 minutes. I want to make sure that nothing shifts while the glue is cooling. Once that's had a chance to cool down, we're going to run a bead of glue along the former near the skin. Once I've applied glue, I'm simply going to close the skin around the former. Again, there's a slight overlap onto the C5 former. Give that a full 2.5 minutes to cool, and then do the same thing on the other side. Once that's had a chance to cool down, we're going to glue our F3, F4 former in place. I'm going to line up the reference marks there at the top. I want to make sure that one layer of foam is sticking out. I also want to point out that it's the F3 former that's sticking out. So my fit looks really good. I'm going to pull the former out. I'm going to run a bead of glue all the way around the inside of the skin. Checking to make sure my reference marks are aligned. And I'm going to wrap the skins all the way around and hold them in place while the glue has a chance to cool. Give that a full 2.5 minutes before moving on. Once that's had a chance to cool down, we're going to cut a bevel all the way around the F3 former. Now that that's done, we need to build a battery box. To build our battery box, let's first take a look at the symbol mapping. We see here and here that we need to remove the foam, so let's do that now. Once we've got the foam removed, we see here that we're going to be creating a B-fold. And remember, a B-fold is where the side plates are beside the bottom plate. So it'll fold up just like this. I'm going to run a bead of glue down each of the channels to 90 degrees. We'll hold this in place for a full 2 minutes while the glue cools. We're going to do the same thing here up on the nose. You'll notice that these two vertical plates are going to be corner to corner. Right where they come together at the corner, I'm going to run a bead of glue and just let it run down. I'll do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to hold this in place until the glue cools, and then I'll put a bead of glue on the other corner. Then I'll put a bead of glue on the outer corners. Once that's had a chance to cool down, we need to fold this ear and this ear towards the center. In order to do that, I'm going to run my straight edge along this line right here, and I'm going to make a score. I'm only going to cut about halfway through. Flip it over, do the same on the other side. Once that's been done, I'm going to take and fold both the ears to the center. And we're going to run this into the fuselage. You can see there's a notch in the battery box that's going to go over the spline. We're going to push this all the way in until the ears can rotate upwards. Next, I'm going to run a bead of glue on the hinge on both of the tabs and fold them back vertical. Once the ears have been glued back in place, I'm going to pull the battery box out until the ears make contact with the former. I'm going to flip the assembly over, and I want to make sure that my box is sitting at 90 degrees using a piece of scrap. Once position looks good, I'm going to run a bead of glue along the side, top, and the other side. We can also add a bead of glue here on the inside where the battery box meets the former, and I'm just shooting some glue down the side. I'm also going to run some glue where the battery box meets the spline. This will really tie everything together. I'm going to slightly pry open the battery box while the glue's cooling. I want to make sure that I've got plenty of room to push my battery in. Now that that's had a chance to cool down, let's take a look at our skin labeled C3. We see that we just need to peel the paper away. Once the paper is peeled away, let's add some shape. Most of the shape I'm going to be adding is going to be right here in the middle and then here on the outer edges. And I'm going to add a little bit of shape all the way along the edge, but I'm going to add a little bit more as I get closer to the edge. Once we've added the shape, we need to ensure that our part is oriented correctly. I made a mental note, our C4 marking is over here. So if I look at my part, I see that the C3 marking will be starting over on this side. We're going to begin what we call the glue and wrap process. We're going to begin gluing right here in the middle. We're going to line up the reference marks. We're going to glue a small amount. We're going to allow the glue to cool. And then we're going to work our way around on one side and then the other. Let's start by adding a bead of glue about 1 inch long right where the former meets the skin. I'm going to line up my reference marks, and just like we did on the previous skin, the part that we are gluing in place will slightly overlap the part that we are gluing to. I'm going to hang this off the edge just a little to make alignment a little easier. Leave this in place for a full 3 minutes before moving on. It's imperative that the glue cools down all the way. We're going to be putting some stress on the part, and it's really easy to add stress to the seam where it'll pop apart. One thing you can do to help with this is you can also run a piece of tape right across the seam. Once that's had a chance to cool down, we're going to simply wrap the skin on around. My seam looks really good, so I'm going to run a bead of glue from the center all the way up as high as I can go. I'm going to gently fold the skin over. You can see that I'm slightly overlapping the previous skin. I'm going to hold this in place for a full 2.5 minutes. I want to make sure that nothing shifts while the glue is cooling. Before moving on, I'm going to add a bevel here on the end. You can see that when I wrap the skin all the way around, I'm going to need to pry that open just slightly. By adding a bevel, that'll really help the fit. If necessary, if you have a little bit of a gap, you can always add a bevel on this side as well. Once that's done, let's add a bead of glue. And we're going to hold that in place for a full 2.5 minutes while the glue cools. Once that's had a chance to cool down, I'm going to run a piece of tape across the seam here on the bottom. I want to make sure that my corners are lined up. Once that's done, I'm going to flip the assembly upside down and I'm going to push straight down. You'll notice when I push straight down that I've got a channel. What I'm going to do is I'm going to fill that channel full of glue, then I'm going to hold it on top of the table just like this so that I've got a nice round edge instead of a V shape when the glue's cooled. So I'm going to hold this in place for a full 2.5 minutes. I want to make sure the glue has plenty of time to cool down so it'll hold that exact shape. Once the glue's had a chance to cool down, grab your F2 former and let's put a bevel all the way around the edge. Once that's been done, we need to carefully slide the former over the battery box, and we need to open up the skin and push the former in place. You want to be very careful that you don't dent the skin up when you're doing this step. If it's too tight on one side or the other, one thing you can do is you can flatten the former on the tabletop. One thing I'm going to do here, this will also help it, is I'm going to add a bevel here at the back. This seems to be the area that's given me problems. As you can see, I'm just kind of working that former in a little bit at a time. You want to be careful not to pinch too hard. You don't want to create a crinkle. You'll definitely want to take your time on this step. You'll notice that the former fits kind of loose. That's okay. I'd always rather have a former fit loose than fit tight. So my former seems pretty tight right here. I'm going to have to remove a little bit of foam when we go to add our next skin. If I don't do that, I'm going to have a little step right here. We'll deal with that in a few minutes. All right, what I'm going to do, now that I've got this positioned, my reference marks look good, I'm going to add a bead of glue where the former meets the skin. I had a little bit of a gap there, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to add a little bit of pressure while the glue's cooling. Once that's had a chance to cool down, we're going to run a bead of glue where the former meets the skin. I'm going to gently squeeze the sides, any excess I'm going to wipe away. And one thing that'll really help this, I'm going to take and push straight down with my thumb on the former, It's going to kind of stretch everything out just a little bit. That'll decrease the gap between the former and the skin. I'm going to hold that for a couple minutes while the glue cools, then we're going to add our next skin. Before we install our C2 skin, we do need to go ahead and attach the motor to the firewall. To do that, I'm going to run the wires through, and I'm going to run a screw at the top and one at the bottom. This will be enough to secure the motor. Once a motor is attached, we're going to pull the wires towards the center. I want to make sure that there's a gap between the foam and the wires so that we can glue this onto the battery box. So we're going to be gluing this on. I'm going to run my wires in, and we're going to be gluing this on just like that. Now you'll notice that the motor is tilted down and it's also tilted to the right. It looks wrong, but if it looks wrong, it's probably right. These small aircraft require quite a bit of down thrust and right hand thrust in order to fly correctly. Now that we've done our test fit, I'm going to pull the motor mount off. I'm going to run a very heavy bead of glue along the sides, along the top, and along the bottom. And I'm going to reinstall it. Once that's done, I'm also going to run a bead of glue where the former meets the battery box. We'll push that off to the side, and while that's cooling down, let's go ahead and take a look at our C2 skin. We see that we just have to remove the paper. Once that's done, we're going to add shape here down the middle, small amount here and here, and then we're going to add quite a bit of shape here on the edge. Do a small amount, and then we're going to go add a lot of shape here near the ends. Small amount, and then a bunch. Once that's done, we're going to line up the registration marks at the top. And we're going to add a bead of glue across the top, a little over 1 inch long. Once that's cooled down, we're going to continue to work our way around. You can see that I'm slightly shingling over the previous part, and I'm going to hold that in place 2.5 minutes. It's helpful to run a piece of tape across the seam. That'll help hold things in place. I'm continuing to make my way around. You'll notice I'm only putting glue on the F2 former. We'll get to the front of the aircraft a little later. Once that's done, do the same thing on the other side. Before we finish gluing the skin in place, I am going to add a bevel on both ends of the skin. Once I've added the bevel, I'm going to go ahead and finish gluing the skin to the former. If you've got a gap right here, you can always pinch the sides very gently, and that'll help close that gap up. Hold that in place until the glue cools, then we're going to seal up the bottom. In order to glue these two edges together, I'm going to run a piece of tape right up to the edge of the paper on both of them. I'm going to run a bead of glue in between them, and I'm going to squeeze the two edges together. You'll notice that I've got a little bit of glue shooting out. That's okay, because I'm going to pull my tape away, and it'll pull all that excess glue with it. Once I have my two edges together, see it's kind of a V shape, I'm going to run a piece of tape across it. Oops. Do that, and then I'm going to roll it over Oops, I've got a gap. I think my tape slipped. Pull that apart, pull my edges back together. And I'm going to bring it up to the edge of the table, smash it down. That'll give it a rounded shape. We'll let that cool down before moving on. Once that's done, we're going to go a little bit crazy with the glue. I want to make sure that this whole assembly doesn't come out. So we're going to be pretty liberal with the amount of glue we're using. I've got a gap here, so I'm going to take and shoot that gap full of glue. Using a piece of scrap, I am going to wipe the excess away. I'm going to let that cool down, then I'm going to work my way around the entire XM mount. So anywhere I've got a gap, I am going to fill that with glue. I'm applying a little bit of pressure to the skin. I want to make that gap spread out over a little bit more of the edge of the former. Once that's been glued in place, let's work on our C1 skin. We see that we need to remove paper. And we're going to add shape all the way across the part. All right, once that's done, we're going to glue the two edges together and we're going to be forming a perfect circle. Hold that in place for a full 3 minutes. Very helpful to run a piece of tape across the seam. Once that's had a chance to cool down, you'll notice that whenever you look at our part from the side, you're going to see some foam sticking out from the edge of the paper. Hold your razor blade flat and let's remove that excess foam. All right, once that's done, locate the reference mark on top, and we're going to line it up to the reference mark on top of the P-40. Now, if you notice over here on the right side, it fits pretty good. We're going to have to create a notch right along the bottom where the firewall is sticking out. I'm going to make a little bit of a mark. I'll turn around to the other side, and we've got two issues over here. You can see that this edge is really bowing out. And you can see that we're going to have to remove a little bit of material where it's making contact with the firewall. The reason that this is poking out on this side but not this side is, if you remember, our firewall is tilted down, but it's also tilted to the right. So this edge is going to stick out a little bit more. We're going to need to do some trimming inside this so that it'll slide over the X mount. But let's begin by first making clearance for the firewall. We've made a mark on either side, so I'm going to take and notch this part right across the seam. All right, we're going to do another test fit. I'm going to line up my reference mark. I want to make sure that that goes over the firewall at the bottom, and I'm going to press right in here. I want to create an indentation where the firewall is making contact right inside here. So I don't know if you can see that in the camera, but there's a pretty distinct line. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go in with a razor blade and carve out a small layer of foam to give us the necessary clearance. If we look at that now, we have a little bit of gap to contend with. That'll be easy to fix, but for the most part, our fit looks really good. Over here on this side, we do have a little bit of a gap, and I might just live with that. That actually looks pretty darn good. All right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a bead of glue right along the edge of the skin. I'm also going to run a bead of glue right along the edge of the wooden piece. Line up my reference marks. This nose piece that I'm installing will slightly overlap the previous part. Once that cools down, we'll glue the underside. Once that cools down, we're going to add one bead of glue there on the underside, and that'll help close up that gap that I pointed out earlier. We'll let that cool down, and then we're going to work on the canopy. The canopy consists of three parts, parts T1, T2, and T3. I've laid them out, and you'll notice that T3, T2, and T1 are all on one side. Make sure that this little T2 doesn't get twisted around in the opposite direction. It isn't the end of the world, but it does fit a little bit better when it's oriented correctly. Let's begin with parts T1 and T3. I'm going to remove paper from both parts. When adding shape, I'm only going to be adding shape right down the middle. That'll be good. On the part labeled T1, we're going to be adding shape all the way across. When adding shape to a curved part, as you're drawing it across, you're always going to want to maintain a 90-degree angle between the part and the table. So as I'm drawing it across and I'm encountering that curve, I'm going to be twisting the part. So I always have 90 degrees between the table and the part. All right, once that's done, we're going to bring two edges together. T1 is going to slightly overlap T3. I'm going to add glue to the edge here of T3. I'm bringing my glue right up to the edge of the paper, and I'm going to bring parts T1 and T3 together, slight overlap onto the T3 part. Hold that in place for 2.5 minutes, and definitely helpful to add a piece of tape across the seam. Do the same thing on the other side. And we're going to let that cool down. Once that's cooled down, we're going to add a pretty steep bevel to the inside of the canopy. Starting at the back, we're going to cut that steep bevel, and as we get close to the front, it's going to turn into a fairly shallow bevel. As I make my way around the front, the shallow bevel is going to turn back into a steep bevel. All right, once that's done, we're going to test fit this onto the fuselage. Once you got your bevel cut, we're going to do a test fit onto the fuselage. I'm lining up my reference mark here at the top, and I'm pushing the canopy up against the tail section. The canopy will be slightly overlapping the tail section. Our fit looks really good, so once we're happy with the test fit, using a razor blade, I'm going to go around the edge of the canopy and create a score on the fuselage. After you've created a line, we're going to bead a glue just inside the line. Also going to run a little bit of glue right along here. And we're going to reinstall our canopy. Hold that in place for a full 2.5 minutes. Once your canopy is glued in place, peel the paper from the T2 skin, and we're going to cut a bevel all the way around. You want to be real careful when cutting a bevel on this part. Once a bevel's been cut, add some shape. We're going to ensure that the markings are on the correct side, and we're going to drop this in place. Okay, the fit looks really good. I'm going to add a bead of glue to the exposed foam. And we're going to drop our piece back in place. Hold that while the glue cools. Once that's done, we need to add some exhaust. To add the exhaust, we're simply going to run the exhaust stacks between the two reference marks. Let that cool for a few seconds, and then we'll flip it over and do the same on the other side. Now we're going to do the intake for the P-40. Now there were two different variants. One of them had a long intake, and then the earlier version had a short intake. So I'm first going to build a large intake, and then we're going to go back and modify it in case you want to do a short intake. This one part can be configured two different ways. First, I'm going to take the backside of my razor blade and run it down the score. Peel the foam away. It's not wanting to cooperate real well. I want to make sure I got all the foam off the paper. All right, once that's done, I am going to go ahead and peel the paper away as well, and I'm going to run a light bead of glue right down the paper. I'm going to roll it 90 degrees and cover up the side. Do the same on the other side. Once that's done, this is a little bit tricky. We're going to need to trim away a little bit of material. What we're going to do is, beginning about 1.5 inches back, we're going to cut a very gentle line all the way to the back of the part. I think the best way to do this is just to go in just a little bit at a time. Just figure on making 7 or 8 passes. If you figure on making 7 or 8 passes, it's just going to make it a lot easier. I think that looks good. Once that's done, I'm going to put this on the top of the nose. It's not going all the way to the end. It's maybe about 1/8 inch from the end. And you just want to make sure it's centered. If you're doing one of the later model P-40s, go ahead and glue the part on just like that. If you intend to do an early model, we need to cut probably about 1.5 inches off. The intake was quite a bit shorter on the early model. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a mark about right here. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to start my cut a little bit earlier. I'm going to taper it back to the end. There aren't near as many pictures of the earlier model, so if you look at this and you feel like it needs to be a little bit shorter, that's okay. You can just cut it off to length and then just add your gradual cut. I think that looks pretty good right there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue this in place. I want to make sure I'm centered. I'm going to hold that down while the glue cools. Now the one thing about the early model is they also included a couple guns up on the nose, so we're going to do that next. If you're wanting to do one of the earlier models and you want to add guns, you'll notice a couple little triangular pieces there in the kit. I'm just going to push these off about 1/2 inch from center. I'm going to create a little mark on either end of it, and I'm going to run a bead of glue between my marks. There's one, and then I'll flip it over and do the same thing on the other side. And I'm going to check this from the front to make sure that my guns are even. One other thing that can be done is we can put a sliver of paper right along the top to hide that foam edge. I'll do something like that. I think that'll clean things up nicely. Got a lot of glue on there. And I'm going to leave the front of that white. That should get it on the fuselage. Let's go ahead and take a look at the wings. Before we get started, let's take a look at the symbols on the wings. We see here that we're going to be removing paper, And we see here on both sides of the score, we're going to be adding a bevel. We also have the bevel symbols over here on the ailerons. Get the paper peeled away, run the back side of a razor blade down the score, break it open, add a bevel, add a second bevel, and I'm going to do the same thing here on the aileron. On the aileron, we're going to add a bead of glue, and we're going to wipe away the excess. Once that's done, let's do the same thing on the other wing. Once both the wings have been prepped, we're going to add shape to give us an airfoil. When adding shape to the wing, we primarily want to add shape to the first 2/3 of the wing. As we get some shape added, we're going to begin working about 1/3 of the wing and add even more shape. That'll be good right there. Let's do the same thing on the other side. All right, once that's done, we're going to bring the two halves together. To bring our two wing halves together, I'm simply going to add a bead of glue on one side or the other. And I'm going to bring the two edges together. We're going to hold this in place while the glue cools. You're welcome to put a piece of tape across the seam. It'll help it while the glue has a chance to cool. You can see I've prepared a pair of 5-gram servos. I've got one arm pointing one way and one arm pointing the other. What we're going to do is we're going to take our first servo. I want to make sure that the servo arm is pointing down, and we're going to rotate it either forwards or backwards to where the servo can drop in just like that. Once the servo's in place, we're going to run a bead of glue where the servo meets the wing skin. You'll want to hold the wing and the servo flat against the table while the glue cools down. Once the glue cools, do the same on the other side. Once the servos have been secured, you'll notice a very small T-shaped mark up here by the servo. What we're going to do is we're going to line up the end of the spar to that little T-shaped mark, and we're going to run the center portion of the spar right up flush against this edge. All right? Once we've got our test fit, I'm going to run a bead of glue across the bottom of the spar, and we're going to glue it in place. Make sure the glue has plenty of time to cool down before we do the other side. To do the other side, I'm simply going to lift the side we just glued up until the spar makes contact with the wing skin, and I'm going to run a bead of glue right across the front. And I'm going to hold this in place while the glue cools. Now that the spar's been glued in place, we need to do the center servo housing. So let's locate these 4 parts out of the kit. They're labeled G1 through G4. Taking a look at our symbol mapping, we see that G1 goes here on top, there's G2, there's G3, and here we've got G4. Now there is one thing about G4 that I want to point out. You'll notice that there's an M. Anytime you see a letter M after the stack symbol, that means we're going to flip the part over when we go to glue it in place. Let's begin by gluing G1 through G3 together. All right, now that those are glued together, let's take a look at the instructions. We see that we need to avoid putting glue between the dotted lines. We also see this little cut symbol, but we've learned that you only cut after the assembly has been put together. Let's go ahead and glue this together now. Should have punched out that center piece first, but that's okay. I say it's okay, and then I make a mess. You're definitely going to make mistakes whenever you're building foam board airplanes. Fortunately, they're easy to fix. Once the glue's had a chance to cool down, using a razor blade, let's go ahead and cut along the dotted lines. I did not get that glued on very well. We're going to let the glue cool for just a few seconds, and then we're going to test fit it onto the lower wing assembly. When doing our test fit, it's very important that you get these two channels towards the trailing edge of the wing. I'm going to drop my block in place. There are some reference marks at the front and the back to help you keep it straight. Test fit looks good. I'm going to run a heavy bead of glue here, here, and here, and I'm going to put quite a bit of glue here in the middle as well. I'm going to push that up all the way against the spar, and we're going to hold that in place until the glue cools. Once the glue's had a chance to cool down, we're going to drop our foam spars in place. They're going to go just like that. I'll run a bead of glue along the bottom. If you've got some excess here at the edge of the wing, you can cut off the excess. And you can also go in and fill this channel full of glue. Now let's do the same on the other side. We'll let the glue cool for a few seconds, then we're going to add the Y connection. Once that's had a chance to cool down, let's add our Y connections. When adding our Y, always make sure that the colors line up with one another. It's always a good idea to add tape to ensure your connections don't come apart. Once we've made our connection, I'm going to add a little bit of glue right here behind the foam spar, and I'm going to glue the connection to the lower wing skin. Next, we're going to fold our upper wing skins over. You can see that I've got my extension coming out the front, just like that. I'm going to run a bead of glue right down the front seam. I'm going to run a heavy bead of glue along the top of the wooden spar and the foam spar. And I'm going to run a bead of glue right along the trailing edge. You can see that I've got my hands flat. I want to hold this down while the glue's cooling. You can also run a heavy bead of glue where the upper wing skin meets this center box. We'll give that 2 or 3 minutes to cool down, then we're going to do the same on the other side. Once the upper wing skins have been glued in place, I've got 2 5-gram servos that I'm holding together. We're going to drop the wires through the bottom, and we're going to drop a pair of servos in place. Notice that the heads of the servos are closest to the leading edge of the wing. Once they've been dropped in place, I'm going to drop a little bit of glue on either end of the servo. We're going to let those cool down for a couple minutes before moving on. Once the servos have been glued in place, we need to remove some paper from the top of the wing skin. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to pull the two parts from the kit that have template etched into them. Using a razor blade, I'm just going to cut through the paper using the template as a guide. Once that's done, we're going to do a test fit of the wings onto the fuselage. Before we do a test fit of the wings onto the fuselage, I'm going to gently bend these trailing edge pieces up just slightly. You can see how they've got a little bit of curl to them now. You'll notice that we've got to feed the push rod housings through these two holes up here in this center block. One of the challenges we run into is that if we just line them up here and push it, we're going to be bending these two pieces pretty badly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back on the fuselage, and you can see I've got plenty of room. And I'm going to bring my wing assembly forward, and I'm going to continue to bring it forward until the push rod housings can flex upwards. I need to align them with the holes, and then we're going to push the wing assembly backwards. We are getting a little bit of stress here, but it isn't too bad. I'm going to flip the whole assembly around. We need to make sure that all the wires are between these two tabs. If you get them over here on the outside, we're going to run into some issues when we go to glue the wing in place. We're going to move the wing assembly all the way backwards, and I'm going to push straight down. All right, next what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a space. I'm going to pull the wing assembly forward, exposing that former, and you can just see a little bit of foam poking through. I'm going to run a bead of glue along the top of that former. I'm also going to lift up the front, and I'm going to shoot a little bit of glue onto the spline. It'll be really hard to catch on the camera. Okay, once I've done that, I'm going to make sure my wires are tucked in just right. I'm going to push the assembly back, and I'm going to press down right in the center. It's a little bit tricky to film all of this because there's a couple different areas that we're applying glue to. Keeping Jesse on his toes today. If you look closely, you're going to see a reference mark here on the fuselage. We have gently curled up this trailing edge piece. I'm lining it up to that reference mark. Once that's done, I'm going to run a heavy bead of glue all the way down. I'm going to stop right here at this fuselage seam and do the same thing on the other side as well. Once the glue's cooled down, we're going to close up the front of the wings. To do that, I'm simply going to hang the nose over the edge of a table, and I'm going to press straight down. I'm going to be applying pressure right here where there's a former. If you push down right here in the middle, you might create a crinkle here in the foam. What I'm going to do is I'm going to leave a little bit of a gap, and I'm going to shoot some glue into that gap. And then I'm going to press straight down. Make sure and give the glue a full 3 minutes to cool down before letting up on the pressure. Once the glue has had a chance to cool, we're going to flip the assembly over and add a bead of glue where these little tabs are coming up. I'm going to be gluing the tabs to the wing assembly. This one needs to be pushed over just slightly so it's making contact with the wing assembly. We're going to let that cool down, then we're going to flip the assembly over and add the wing fairings. Wing fairings can be a little bit tricky. One thing you can do is you can take the two wing fairings in your kit and you can trace them out and make some additional ones. So if you happen to mess one up, you've got plenty of extra foam to give it another try. Looking at our fairings, you can see that we're going to be peeling paper away from one side. Once that's done, I'm going to flip them over and I'm going to add a very steep bevel on all edges. and the steeper the better. Once that's done, I'm going to lay the fairings on top of a paint can, and I've got a smooth wrench, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start applying pressure forward and backwards right along the edge. In order to achieve a very smooth reverse curve, it's very important that you spend a lot of time out on the edges before you begin moving towards the center. As you get close to the end, I just go in one direction. If you bring it back the other way, this is eventually going to catch and fold up. So I've done this quite a few times, and you can see I've only come in a little over 1/4 of an inch. The more time you spend on the edges, the better the result. I still haven't gone in more than 1/2 of an inch. Now I'm going to start moving towards the center, just a little bit. So now you can see we've got a nice smooth reversed curve. Once I'm happy with the shape, I'm going to bring it over, and there's 3 points that we're going to be lining up. We're going to be lining up a point here at the trailing edge of the wing. We're going to be lining up a point where the wing meets the fuselage, and we're going to be meeting up right here in the back where this upper wing skin bends upwards. I'm going to remove a little bit of material with a razor blade. I didn't get my bevel quite deep enough. I don't like the way that's laying against the upper wing skin. Okay, I'm happy with that. So what I'm going to do, using a razor blade, I'm going to create a score on the fuselage. It's a little bit tricky to film this. All right, now I'm going to run a bead of glue just inside that score I created. And I really wasn't paying attention. Looks like I made a little mess with the glue here. One thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of glue right here, and I can push that down gently and close that gap. Once that's done, we're going to do the same thing on the other side. Once your fairings are in place, we're going to flip the assembly upside down, add some details, and install the pushrod housings. Next, we're going to add 4 flaps to the underside of the fuselage. You'll see these 4 pieces in your kit. You'll notice that one edge has a slight curve to it. Let's begin by removing paper from one side of each of the 4 pieces. Once we remove the paper, I'm going to add just a little bit of shape. And starting here in the middle, I'm going to glue my first flap in place. And notice I don't have it coming straight down, it's angled up just slightly. While that's cooling down, I'll do the next one. And we'll do the same on the other side. Once we've got our flaps glued in place, let's go ahead and install the push rods for the elevator and the rudder. You'll notice that I've got my push rod Z-bend run through the innermost hole of the single arm. I'm going to feed my first push rod into one of the 2 housings and connect the servo arm to the servo. Next, I'm going to secure it with a screw, and we'll do the same thing on the other side. Now that we've got the push rods installed, now you can check out the servo install video, the motor install video, and the receiver setup video located in this playlist. Now that we've got the electronics taken care of, let's finish the aircraft out by building up the accessory cover. You can see here that we need to remove the paper, so let's do that now. Let's go ahead and add some shape. Once we've added shape, we're going to slide these up and underneath the flaps. All right, it's looking a little bit too tight, so there's a couple things that we're going to do. First, we're going to go around the edge and we're going to add a bevel. Now that we've added a bevel, it ought to fit a little bit better. Looks like it's still not going all the way up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove a little bit of material from the sides. A lot of times we get a little bit of glue buildup in the corners, so I'm going to cut the corners off at about 45 degrees. All right, now that drops in just fine. Anytime you see a circle with a hashtag in it, that means we're going to be adding some magnets. I'm going to start by pulling the foam out of each of these circles, creating a pair of cavities. I'm going to begin by filling one of the cavities with glue and dropping in my first pair of magnets. I want to make sure when I push the magnets in, one of the 2 magnets is still up above the top of the foam. I'll do the same on the other one. While the glue's cooling down, I'm going to add an X to both of the magnets. I'm going to make a pull tab for our accessory cover. I'm going to do that by taking a piece of tape and folding it over like this, and then just cutting it about a 1/2 inch wide. I'm going to apply a little bit of glue where the tape is sticky, and I'm going to drop it in place. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a bead of glue on each of the magnets. I'm going to quickly install my door. want to make sure it's pushed all the way forward, and I'm going to drop it down here in the back. If you have a gap right here, that's okay. You can just go and you can add a little bit more shape to your accessory cover, and that gap will close right up. We'll let that glue cool down, and then using your pull tab, you can just pull up slightly, pull the whole door backwards. You can see I got a little bit excited and went ahead and installed the canopy. Got a little ahead of myself. All right, so to do the prop install, I'm checking to make sure that it is a counterclockwise prop. We're going to drop that on. I'm going to go ahead and show the installation of the optional spinner. So in order to install the prop and the spinner, you're going to install the prop as you typically do, but you're also going to put this collar in place. And then we're going to get the nut started. And then all we need to do is cinch this down. Before installing your spinner, you're going to need to trim it for a counterclockwise prop. These spinners may be trimmed for either a clockwise or counterclockwise prop. For counterclockwise, I'm simply going to follow the dotted line and remove just a slight amount of material. Flip it around and do the same on the other side. With that done, all we need to do is push the spinner into place. Once your prop is secured and your spinner's been trimmed up, simply push your spinner straight on and your aircraft is finished.